which of these questions wouldn't have entered any of our minds? And yet there's a deafening silence around Sarah of any such protest. Genesis 23. This will undoubtedly be the shortest of all our Genesis classes. Simply because of the subject matter at hand. I could, I suppose, if I wanted to, labor some of the points. But I hate when other preachers do that when I'm listening to them, so that's off the cards. I believe not only in Scripture, but in life we can only play the hand we're dealt. And anything more than that is a bluff. And I'm not entirely convinced all bluffing is righteous. It isn't that the subjects raised within the chapter are unimportant. Far from it. It's simply that not every piece of music merits or warrants accompaniment by a full orchestra. Sometimes, as the birth of rock and roll proved to us, sometimes all that is necessary to make the most profound music is a bass and a guitar. Now, chapter 23 is a little more than a bass and a guitar, but and shouldn't be thought any less of because of that. But to make a text say more than it's actually saying is to make the text say less than it's actually saying. I'm pretty sure that's nearly accurate. I guess it depends on who's doing the saying and why. In any event, Abraham says goodbye to his beloved wife, Sarah. And in the process, not only honors her, but also, as is now his custom, honors his God. Both of whom have evidently never left his side since their initial meeting. Well, except on those occasions when Abraham made, at best, questionable judgments in effort to save both their lives, and he surrendered Sarah into the hands of other men, who then had to be rescued by God. But, you know, if you're going to be rescued by anyone, God's just the man for the job. We'll recall that Sarah had her moments of bitterness and meanness, vindictiveness and hardness of heart. They were very real moments and caused no little amount of hardship and suffering for others. And to ignore them would be to open us to the charge of willful blindness or partiality, favoritism for those who we deem to be on our side. So we won't do that. We'll refuse to look at life, especially in a fallen world, through rose-tinted glasses. And we'll aim to view everything around us as we believe God would have us see things. However, to take those moments in Sarah's life and use them to eradicate the history of an entire lifetime, a wife who followed her husband faithfully, and more often than not, it appears to a T, into an unknown land for decades, waiting on a promise that always seemed over the next hill or around the next corner, or perhaps after this birthday, or maybe the next birthday, or the one after that, through feast and famine, both of which are equally dangerous depending on who you're dealing with, through safety and danger, both of which are equally dangerous depending on who we're dealing with. To ignore the larger testimony of her life wouldn't be fair at all. It's to Sarah that Peter refers to in 1 Peter 3 when describing precisely what a godly woman consists of. A woman Peter describes who refuses to adorn herself with the treasures of this world, but rather finds her beauty within her God and beside her husband. I've pointed out more than a few times that what makes Abraham so particularly special is that Abraham didn't have Abraham as an example. Well, if that's true, and it is true, then it's also equally true that Sarah didn't have Sarah as an example either. The lives that we read in Scripture are being lived as we read them, and they're as real to the people in the texts as our life is to us. And I'm sure they get up on the wrong side of the bed some days. I'm sure they had bad weeks, bad years. Other problems that the Bible's not describing because it's not important to the drive of the text. I think it's a very real temptation sometimes to read Scripture like a Monday morning quarterback, and through our own fantasies imagine that we would have performed much better under the same circumstances than those we read about in the biblical witness. I'm not convinced that's true. We can barely reach the peak of their performances, and we do have them as an example. Unless perhaps you're thinking tonight that you would have taken more steps on Galilee than Peter would have. If the Bible had told a story of a wife constantly complaining and asking her husband when and where these promises are going to appear from this imaginary voice that you heard back in Ur, are you sure you heard a voice? Are you sure you didn't imagine it? This is a long time. This is a long way from home. Are you sure it's a voice you can trust? Which of these questions wouldn't have entered any of our minds? And yet there's a deafening silence around Sarah of any such protest. At her worst, it appears, she laughed one day when doubting God. And God refused to look at that through rose-tinted glasses. So neither should we. But perhaps that very verse is included to expose the meagerness of her distrust. And if so, then bravo, Sarah. When all is said and done, good for her. I desire nothing more or less to be said about me when I'm gone. Good for Billy. In spite of himself, he trusted his God. Good for him. That'll do me. The other noteworthy thing in the chapter that's even briefer to mention is Abraham's refusal to take Sarah back to Ur and bury her in the past. Abraham believes God to be the God of resurrection and of promise-keeping. Therefore, Abraham insists on buying some land that God himself has promised Abraham would one day be his or his descendants, and that's where he buries his Sarah. Abraham buries Sarah in the future of God's people. Abraham buries his wife in accordance to the promises of his God. Abraham buries his wife in the direction God never tires of instructing his children to look and to walk. We walk by faith and not by sight. We forget what lies behind and we press on toward the goal. We set our minds on things that are above. It is to an onward, upward, heavenly drum we march to. And when all is said and done, this couple have served us well in showing us how broken people, meandering through life with nothing but a promise, are loved, welcomed, embraced, and saved by a God who keeps his promise. Thoughts, comments, questions?